The Ottoman Empire dominated southeastern Europe, Turkey, and the Middle East for 400 years, from the time of their establishment to the peak of their power in the 17th and 18th centuries. However, underneath such magnificence was the foundation made of dark and messed up practices that would besmirch their legacy and eventually resulted in their fall. Welcome to Nutty History, and today let's find out what creepy things were normal in the Ottoman Empire. We all fight, prank, and tease our siblings. The reason behind such attention-seeking is the unconditional love we have for our brothers and sisters. Despite giving each other a hard time, siblings are also the first to stand up for their siblings when in need. Even though some horrible things happen as an exception, such as fratricide, at least we can be content knowing that we don't have it as bad as the Ottoman Empire. Unlike their tradition, people today don't grow up preparing to kill all of their brothers before their brothers can kill them. In the early generations of the Ottoman Empire, the practice of primogeniture wasn't strictly followed. Primogeniture was, or is, the practice of a firstborn legitimate child, preferably male, inheriting the belongings of his father after his passing. The Ottoman Empire did things differently back then. When Mehmed the Conqueror besieged Constantinople, his own uncle was fighting against him from the walls. In typical Ottoman fashion, Mehmed dealt with his uncle. He offered no mercy after he took the throne, and he had a message for future generations of Ottomans. He began rounding up all of his male relatives and executing them. His ruthlessness didn't even have an exception for his younger brother, who was just an infant in the crib. Mehmed had him asphyxiated without batting an eye. Once Mehmed was done disposing all his possible competitors for the throne, he proclaimed, "And to whomsoever of my sons the Sultanate shall pass, it is fitting that for the order of the world he shall kill his brothers." Most of the ulema allowed this, so let them act on this. Thus began a series of generational civil wars where every sultan successor of the Ottoman Empire had to soak their hands in their own brothers', cousins', and uncles' blood to secure the throne for themselves. It is said that another Mehmed, Mehmed III, was so heartbroken that he tore his beard off in agony as his younger brother begged for mercy and swore again and again to never raise a weapon against him. Yet, bound by the family tradition, Mehmed III turned away without speaking a word, and the loyalists killed the young boy along with the rest of the 18 brothers of Mehmed III. Bodies of all 19 siblings were thrown out on the streets of Istanbul, and it is said that the whole city cried for their souls that night. Now mind you, the murders would not just stop after the Sultan would secure the throne. The hunt for all of the royal family's relatives would be carried on relentlessly. Even Suleiman the Magnificent's hands were not clean, as he had his son asphyxiated on the streets with a bowstring just because his popularity had become a matter of paranoia for the most acclaimed sultan of the Ottomans. However, when Ahmed, first of his name, abruptly died in 1617, a general agreement was struck between the relatives and the family he left behind. Instead of drenching the streets of Istanbul with royal blood this time, the clergy quietly established the practice of primogeniture and announced his younger brother Mustafa I as the new emperor because Ahmed's sons were too young to rule. Mustafa himself was spared by his brother Ahmed I, as the 12-year-old and 13-year-old brothers were too close to order death toward one another. Since then, the policy of killing relatives changed to incarcerating them. Potential heirs to the throne would be confined to the Topkapi Palace. In Istanbul, these special apartments would be referred to as the caves. However, in English, this translates to the cages. A prince of the Ottoman Empire would have to possibly spend his whole life in prison in the cave while being monitored day and night by guards. These princes were given all sorts of luxury, and they were able to live a lavish lifestyle fit for royal kin, but the restrictions of house arrest were enforced strictly. This caused many of the princes to go mad from boredom or become heavily debauched. When a new sultan would be taken to the Gate of Felicity to receive the allegiance of the viziers, that very well would be the first time for him to be outside in decades. Not an ideal preparation for a man who was about to become the ruler, was it? And even though the ritualistic civil wars were put to an end, the royal relatives would still live their lives in constant fear of losing their heads at any second. Now, we know you might be feeling pity for those young princes and other relatives which sultans of the Ottoman Empire incarcerated for the simple crime of being related to them. However, do not curse the Sultan for being a heartless monarch, as their life was no better. It might come as a shock to you, but being a Sultan of the Ottoman Empire meant next to no freedom. life in top copy was suffocating, no matter if you were a sultan or his potential heir. According to the clergy and viziers, a sultan must have the wisdom of speaking only when necessary to convey the core message. The quieter a sultan would be, the wiser and more regal he might appear. But the truth of the matter was that clergy, eunuchs, and viziers liked sultans to stay quiet so they could make his decisions for him. A particular sign language was developed for the sultans to convey their needs and decisions, therefore having sultans spending most of their days in utter silence. The palace was filled with viziers, courtiers, eunuchs, and concubines who were hungry for gossip. They would smother the sultan in an attempt to gather more power in their favor. Ahmed III was so exasperated that he had to occasionally force pages and orderlies out of his room so he could have a private moment to put his pants on. Even then, the population in his private chamber would be about half a dozen people, including the sword-bearers who were tasked with throwing extra people out for him. A sultan had many struggles. This included the internal tug-of-war between factions and personnel, creepy quiet halls of a huge palace, bottling up the anxiety, depression, paranoia, and the guilt of imprisoning and killing your own kin. Did we mention they had to keep their food hole shut for the majority of the day? No wonder a lot of them became insane or gravely ill in such an intoxicating atmosphere. One of the most famous elements of the Ottoman Empire was the harem. In the early generations of the Ottoman Empire, royal marriages were coveted for forging alliances, rendering them mere diplomatic negotiations and nothing more. However, Ottomans soon realized that concubines were easier to maintain, and thus harems emerged as the keep for the Sultan's concubines. Interestingly, the harem was managed by the Sultan's mother. Technically, the harem was a women's only place in the royal Ottoman home. Men were not allowed to enter the harem except the bedroom to spend the night with one of the wives or concubines. The mother would also act as the procurer of fine lace for her son, and make sure he would not spend too much time with one wife or concubine so that none of the women could influence the Sultan too much and become powerful on her own. Also, after bearing a son, a concubine was forbidden from sleeping with the Sultan again, so others could have their shot. Between the years 1533 and 1656, the harem gained too much control and influence over the royal court and practically ran the empire from behind their screens and curtains. This period of 130 years is now known as the Sultanate of Women. Any number of concubines were allowed in the palace at one time, and all of the sons born from a slave concubine were considered legitimate if the Sultan wished for it. However, to earn the right to sleep with the Sultan, a concubine had to get clearance from the Sultan's mother. When Murad III spent too much time with his favorite wife, Safia, his mother, Sabanu Sultan, convinced him to sleep with other women in the harem, and his sister even presented him with more concubines. Ottomans were also known for their fierce justice. Well, calling it justice would be downplaying the situation. Let's just say their punishment system liked to distribute beheadings. The first court of Topkapi Palace featured two pillars on which executioners would hang the severed heads. The pillars were also accompanied by a fountain so the executioners could clean themselves after the beheadings. During the palace surge, mounds of tongues might be piled up in the first court like seasonal decorations, while a special cannon fired every time a body was thrown into the sea. One might assume Ottomans hired a whole corps of executioners for executing, because it was such a laborious job, multiple death sentences and all. Yeah, that wasn't the case though. Apparently, sultans and viziers found the gardeners of the royal palace qualified enough for the job. Seriously? Did they think clipping branches and clipping necks were the same thing? In the early days of the empire, the sultan's officials prided themselves on their obedience to his whims, and it was customary for them to face execution with quiet grace. Also, it was forbidden to spill the blood of royalty and high-ranking officials, so they had to be asphyxiated instead. That is why head gardeners were chosen for executioner duties, not because of their troweling skills, but based on how huge and muscular they were. While most viziers accepted their punishment with grace and dignity, that was not always the case. During the late 18th century, viziers were granted a second chance if they could literally escape the punishment. Yes, the sultans turned the officer's execution into a sport. Hunger Games, anyone? The official would be summoned to a meeting with the head gardener, and after exchanging greetings, the vizier would be handed a cup of iced sherbet. If it was white, the sultan had granted him a reprieve. But if it was red, he was to be executed. As soon as a vizier saw the red sherbet, he would start sprinting towards the exit. The goal was to make his way to the fish market gate before the head gardener could catch him. The path, well, it wasn't short and it wasn't easy. The vizier would have to make his way through the palace gardens, find his way between shady cypress trees and rows of tulips, run across the grated harem windows where women would watch in amusement as vizier would dash towards the gate for his life. If the vizier made it, his life would be pardoned, reducing his sentence to exile. If the gardener caught him, well, usually the facade was nothing more than a source of entertainment for the Sultan. The rest of the palace viziers were frail, old, or middle-aged men. Some were obviously out of shape to outrun a much fitter and stronger head gardener. Still, interestingly, there were a few winners. Hassi Saleh Pasha was the last vizier to face the death race and survive. He was widely congratulated by the Sultan and the rest of the attendees, and later he became a provincial governor. One of the most notorious features of early Ottoman rule was the Devshirme, also known as blood tax among Europeans. Now, this blood tax was a collection of 20% of children ages between 12 to 14 from every Christian city, village, or country under the rule of the Ottomans. These kids would be circumcised and forcefully converted to Islam, and most of them would enroll in the Janissary Corps. The Janissary Corps was an elite infantry unit of the Ottomans who were tasked to guard the Sultan and his palace. This was the first modern standing army in Europe. Ottoman officials would visit the Christian villages and summon all the boys to check their names against the baptismal record from the local church. The kids would then be ranked based on their strength, agility, and endurance. On average, they took one boy from every 40 households. These boys, now deemed slaves, would be grouped and taken to Istanbul. The Ottomans didn't care if the weaker ones dropped dead on their march to Istanbul. The Ottomans also kept a detailed description of these young slaves so they could be tracked down in case they successfully managed to escape. In Istanbul, further training and conditioning awaited, turning these kids into faithful Muslims and loyal soldiers before they joined the Janissary. The most handsome and intelligent ones found their place in the imperial elite by the side of the Sultan. As horrible and devastating as taming and abducting Christians was, Ottomans had one rule about it. It was forbidden to take a family's sole child or children of men who had already served in the Ottoman military. Orphans and Hungarians were off limits due to trust issues. So, what do you think? Were Ottomans that great history as history sometimes portrays them, or not? Tell us in the comments. Today, when we say ancient Egypt, we condense the history of over 5,000 years as if it all happened at once, when in fact Cleopatra's reign of Egypt is closer to us by many millennia than it is from the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Over the years, as humanity evolved in Egypt, they created a lot of rituals and chores which might not be considered normal today. In fact, we might call them outright crazy. Welcome to Nutty History, and let's look at all the weird, creepy stuff ancient Egyptians did which overshadows our trend to walk like an Egyptian by miles. The ancient Egyptian god Khnum was a busy god. He was responsible for the desert's water, the beginning of life, the creation of gods, and the protection of the afterlife. That's a lot of work. Depicted with a head of a ram as his head, Khnum was also the god of fertility and associated with the creation of humans. The word Khnum in the ancient Egyptian language meant construct or build. Ancient Egyptians believed that Khnum used a potter's wheel to create humans and gods alike from clay, like a china, cutlery, not country. And thus Egyptians of the past believed that they were made of clay, like pottery in their homes. Khnum not only created the bodies of humans, but also built every human's ka, or spirit. The spirit or life force was the blessing of Khnum to keep humans healthy and willing to live. Ancient Egyptians also believed that Khnum created the first egg, and when that egg hatched, the sun appeared out of it. Forget Eggs Benedict. A son might be more beneficial in the long run. Khnum was a popular god during the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom and was often referred to as the father of fathers and mother of mothers of the pharaohs. Ancient Egyptians believed that the old god Atum created the universe. Much like Lord Shiva in Vedic mythology, Atum was considered the one who was there before the beginning and the one who will continue to exist after the end. Before Khnum came into existence, it was believed that Atum was responsible for creating the first batch of gods. As Atum was lacking a partner at the beginning of the universe to create the gods, Shu and Tefnut, he resorted to other measures. The sperm of Atum developed into his children without the involvement of a woman. The myth perpetrated in belief among ancient Egyptians was that the male seed brings fertility and prosperity. At men's feast every year, the general public and the ruling pharaoh would perform a holy rite for ensuring a good harvest and prosperity. Upon arriving at the shore, the pharaoh would remove his clothes and keep himself busy to offer his semen to the river. Whoa, there was no censorship back in the day. You'd get arrested for that today, pharaoh or not. And then the rest of the men would practice the ritual paying tribute to Atum. All I can say is do not even think about drinking their H2O. This was a ceremony held every year to recreate the gift given by Atum to nourish the Nile. Everybody knows how much Egyptians of the past were obsessed about the cycle of life and death. Their fascination with scarabs or dung beetles was also related to this obsession. According to entomologist Eve Camberfort, ancient Egyptians saw scarabs emerging with a rolling ball of poop and disappearing in the desert as somewhat akin to the sun coming out and setting up every day. Oddly enough, these critters do indeed have impressive celestial powers. Dung beetles, like the scarab, are incredible navigators that use the sun as guidance when moving their quarries. Rolling the dung ball along, the beetle will periodically stop, climb atop its price, look around to orient itself, and climb back down and start pushing the ball once more. This is why the solar god Khepri of ancient Egypt had a face of a dung beetle symbolizing the rolling of the ball of fire from east to west in the celestial sky. You can see where this is going, right? If Khepri is a scarab, then the sun becomes the ball of poop, and thus the poop becomes a symbol of immortality and reincarnation among ancient Egyptians. Now hold on, there are levels to this. It gets a little more interesting. The old Egyptians considered fecal excrement of all animals sacred and incorporated them in their medicines. Poop from gazelles and dogs and cats and donkeys, etc. was used in various assortments of cures and ointments. Some were used in spiritual rituals and exorcism as well. But the crocodile was special of all, for it wasn't just a medicine, it was also considered a contraceptive. The 4,000-year-old Kahun gynecological papyrus was medical records detailing all about the means and measures used by the old Egyptians for birth control. The document is filled with bizarre practices. Ancient Egyptian men were in fact one of the earliest practitioners of using prophylactics during lovemaking. But these contraceptives were made out of the same fabric they used for loincloth. However, if you think that was weird, get this. A mixture of honey and crocodile dung was used by ancient Egyptian women as pessary. Now, using a block made out of honey and crocodile dung as pessary sure sounds disgusting. The acidic manure acted as a spermicide, and any bugs that the dung might have carried were taken care of by honey because of its antibacterial properties, which also helped in taking care of STDs and SIDs. So sure, the mixture of crocodile dung and honey sounds repulsive and sticky to say the least, but at the same time it was a practice that the Egyptians thought worked. Pregnancy tests in ancient Egypt times were very different from what is used nowadays. Whatever the case, women today are lucky to have modern-day pregnancy tests to let them know when it's time for a visit to the clinic or to give the good news to their loved ones. Ancient Egyptians, surprisingly, had a similar method for their pregnancy checks. In the first known pregnancy test, ancient Egyptian women would go to fields of recently seeded wheat and barley and urinate on seeds. If these seeds would sprout rather quickly than their usual blooming period, it would mean a positive pregnancy. It might sound like old age hocus pocus, but the modern pregnancy sticks work kind of the same way. During pregnancy, there is a specific hormone in the pee of women, and that hormone helps seeds to sprout faster. The modern sticks detect the amount of the same hormone in the women's pee to conclude if they are pregnant or not. One of the most fascinating things about ancient Egypt for Greek historian Herodotus was the equality in Egyptian society. Unlike Greece and Rome, where women had a somewhat inferior social status than men, Egypt allowed women to not only own property and rule, but they were also allowed to work in any field they wanted. There were female healers, female high priestesses, female military officers, and whatnot. In kind of the same way, men enjoyed privileges in ancient Egypt that were considered feminine in the outside world. Men of Egypt wore their makeup with confidence, like women. Thick eyeliners and cat's eye designs were predominantly popular along with the highlight and perfume wigs. Animal oils and fats were used as moisturizers by men and women alike. Henna, popular in modern cultures today, was used to create fancy tattoos. It is believed that makeup not only makes them fabulous, but also acts as skin protectant. But the equality didn't stop there. Men of Egypt also had those times of the month. Wait, male menstruation? Did I read that right? Despite all the hygienic and cultural practices for purity, ancient Egypt had a lot of diseases, and unfortunately, one of them was schistosomiasis, which made people urinate and poop blood. It was so widespread that people didn't even think it was a disease. They thought men were menstruating. Egyptians accepted that males had periods like women as part of growing up. They even believed that bleeding was a sign of fertility in men, only if they knew that it was not a sign of fertility, but it was an STD. Woo woo, that's the sound of the police. Woo woo, that's the sound of the police. Oh, sorry. Yes, quite literally, in ancient Egypt, if you heard a herd of monkeys running in your direction screaming in monkey language, run. Consider yourself a wanted man and an outlaw because the warrant was out and the cops were coming to get you. Cops that were baboons. Seriously, this could be a great comedy movie with Jim Carrey as their commissioner. Hollywood, are you listening? Anybody? Cats were the most popular choice, but ancient Egyptians were in love with all sorts of animals. There were hardly any animals in the African biosphere that Egyptians hesitated to utilize as pets. Lions, ibises, gazelles, hippos, fish, birds, monkeys, baboons. Ancient Egyptians were known for their exotic pets, but not all of them were for show. Like dogs used by modern police departments across the globe to assist the authorities in search, trace, and detect, ancient Egyptians used baboons. Hieroglyphs and artwork that have survived ages depict Egyptian authorities using baboons on leashes to apprehend criminals. One shocking bit of classical Egyptian artwork depicts authorities unleashing a baboon on a thief in a marketplace, and the criminal begging them to call the animal off as it bites his leg. Pet baboons in ancient Egypt also knew how to pick fruits and dance, and even better, make beer. Their owners loved them so much that some mummies were found with tattoos and artworks of baboons. I might want a baboon to help me around the house. So, what do you think? Did we miss any of the weird social norms of ancient Egypt? And would you like to walk and talk and live like an ancient Egyptian? Maybe have your own monkey make you coffee in the morning? Tell us in the comments. The toga-wearing ancient Romans are considered models for many elements of human civilization, which have prevailed till modern times. However, there are certain things about the Roman civilization that we should be thankful for becoming a thing of the past. Welcome to Nutty History, and today let's find out what creepy things were normal in ancient Rome. Greeks were not the only party animals of the European circle in ancient times. Rome's wealthiest population liked to party too, and they partied hard. Their feasts were lavish, long-lasting, and extremely ludicrous. The wealthy Romans consumed food like drugs in these feasts, and the food was not regular. It was made out of exotic animals, birds, and fish, and the more exotic the food, the more the party would be considered successful by the guests. Songbirds like pheasant and thrush, raw oysters, lobster, shellfish, venison, wild boar, and peacocks were common at a wealthy feast. Foods that were forbidden by sumptuary laws, such as fattened fowl and sow's udders, were flagrantly consumed at the most exclusive feasts, which were equivalent to modern VIP nightclubs. So that's what goes on the other side of those velvet ropes? A surviving literary work of ancient Rome, Apicius is the account of cooking recipes that were invented to appease and amaze the guests and such extravagant feasts. But it wasn't the exotic and absurd food that was the creepy part of these profligate parties. The actual creepy thing about these feasts were the guests and their insatiable gluttony. Unlike modern times, where eating as little as possible is considered the classy thing to do, Romans like to gorge on their servings, and they like to keep doing it all night long. Cue Lionel Richie. Though some Americans with a bucket full of chicken wings like to dismiss it, the fact is the human stomach is not a black hole that can devour everything you throw in it. So, Romans had to get a little creative for partying and eating till dawn. Their splendidly disgusting idea to accomplish that was to simply regurgitate the food after consuming it. Yep, they will just throw up voluntarily whatever they enjoyed eating a few minutes ago and then carry on dining as if nothing happened. Some people kept special bowls around the table for the purpose of collecting the bile, while others gave no care and they just puked straight up all over the floor and then they carried on eating. Ew! ooh, and ooh. In our video about creepy things that were normal in ancient Greece, we talked about how grime collected off Olympic athletes was treated like medicine and how crazy Greeks were about it. Turns out their successors of civilization were not much wiser about such magic potions either. If Greece had Olympic athletes, Rome had gladiators. And, like Greeks, Roman women loved to enjoy rubbing dead cells of dead gladiators on their faces like skin cream to attract men. Not only that, Romans were even a step ahead of the Greeks, as they would also enjoy drinking the blood of dead gladiators, hoping that it would cure epileptics. Strangely, some Roman physicians actually reported that this treatment worked. The origins of the sacred or apoplectic properties of blood of a slain gladiator likely lie in the Etruscan funeral rites. Etruscan civilization was a precursor to Rome in Italy, which was mostly settled around the modern city of Tuscany. Although the influence of this religious background faded during the Roman Republic, the magical use of gladiators' blood continued for centuries. After the prohibition of gladiatorial combat in about 400 AD, an executed individual became the legitimate successor to the gladiator, and the practice of selling blood potion carried on. Occasional indications in early modern textbooks on medicine, as well as reports in the popular literature of the 19th and early 20th century, document the existence of this ancient magical practice until modern times. But now, as we have advanced much further medically and humanly, we know how crazy Romans were, drinking the blood of a dead person like a vampire. I want you to drink my blood. However, if you think that was the extent of Roman craziness, wait till you hear about their rulers. Talking about mad regents of ancient Rome, everybody knows stories of Nero, whose obsession to become a singer cost hundreds of Roman lives, and Caligula, who tried to make his horse a senator. But madness and mental illnesses were quite common among many Roman rulers that may have you believe that insanity was perhaps one of the qualifications to become an imperator. For example, Commodus, who was played by the talented Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator, was indeed fond of fighting gladiators and had a delusion that he was Hercules reincarnated. Caracalla was known for his short temper and for murdering his own brother Geta and his followers, and later massacring many leading citizens of Alexandria, Egypt. Elagabalus, who became Roman emperor shortly after Caracalla, was the stark opposite of his predecessor. The teenage emperor was known for prostituting himself, sacralizing Roman religion and gods, and forcing a Vestal virgin into marrying him. His reign is known only for his extreme eccentricity, decadence, zealotry, and promiscuity. Empress Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, was one step ahead of Elagabalus in matters of promiscuity and perversion. The marriage of Claudius and Messalina was mismatched, for Claudius was old and disinterested in family matters, while Messalina was only 18. But she was an important figure in Rome, as she was the great-grandniece of the first Roman emperor, Augustus. Being ignored in a marriage that only existed on paper didn't sit too well with her, and when Claudius succeeded Caligula as emperor, Messalina used her new powers to liberate herself from the prison-like marriage. Highly attractive, Messalina was eye candy for many suitors. Long-term repression made her revolt most absurdly, as she ended up bedding over 150 lovers. She was also known for sneaking into brothels at night and challenging the most successful prostitutes of the city in a stamina war. It is recorded that Messalina managed to beat Rome's best escort, Scylla, by pleasing 25 men in a night, while Scylla nearly fainted after the 24th. Later, while Claudius was in Ostia, Messalina eloped with Senator Gaius Silius, and the two lovers had an extravagant wedding with the feast and everything. When Claudius's advisors heard of it, they ordered her to commit suicide, even though Claudius was benign towards her. Ancient Rome wasn't much different from the modern world when it comes to attitude towards making love. While males were allowed to flaunt their conquest in beds, women were repressed and had to act properly in public and avoid taboos. However, unlike modern times, phallus figures were not taboo at all. In fact, they were the biggest craze in ancient Rome. Do you remember the fictional Wumpus advertisement from that episode of Rick and Morty? Well, that fictional ad could have been inspired by the reality of Rome, as the ancient empire was filled with phallic totems, phallic charms, and phallic decors. Male genitalia was considered a good luck charm, an award against evil, so wearing phallic necklaces was pretty common among Roman men. They would also draw figures of manhood on bridges and road signs to keep travelers safe. But Rome was not the leading city of creating trends when it comes to adult art in the Roman Empire. That title goes to Pompeii, the city that was destroyed by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The lava and ash that buried Pompeii left the city well preserved as a historic account for archaeologists. However, the historians were not that proud to show their findings to the world until the 20th century. The town was full of the craziest erotic artwork to the extent that every other tile on the road had its own special display of obscenity. Tourists to this day can still see these artworks while visiting Pompeii. Ancient Rome was the zenith of plumbing for its time, but that doesn't mean everything about their bathhouses and lavatories was the peak of sanitation. As toilet paper did not exist back then, Romans were known for using a sponge attached to the end of a stick, known as a poop stick, to wipe their rears after defecating. However, the disgusting part was that these sticks were used multiple times, by multiple people, on the same day, and they were hardly washed in between. I think I just threw up in my mouth a little bit. But if you are thinking that sharing butt parasites was the biggest danger of using Roman lavatories, think again. Things are about to get explosive. Yes, the biggest danger of sitting down to poop in ancient Rome was to pray that the toilet wouldn't detonate. As the plumbing was quite preliminary and basic in these toilets, there was a serious hazard of methane buildup under the commodes, and the pressure could burst out any minute. Also, having so much filth in these pipes caused a lot of pest infestation in toilets, which means there was also a good chance of being bitten by a rabid creature in the delicates while taking care of business. Instead of coming up with a better solution for plumbing, Romans resorted to magic and worship to solve their washroom worries. Magical spells meant to keep demons at bay were cast on the walls of bathrooms. Few washrooms were built with statues of Fortuna, the goddess of luck, inside them to guard the visitors. It is suspected that Romans also worshipped a certain god called Crepitus, no pun intended, who was the god of toilets and flatulence to keep themselves safe while doing number 2. There's a god for toilets and flatulence? Okay. So what do you think? Would you risk going to the washroom in ancient Rome? Or would you wait for a couple hundred years to get the proper plumbing like we have today? Could you hold it that long? Or do you think we missed some creepy fact about ancient Rome? Tell us in the comments. Discoverers of silk, inventors of gunpowder, and practitioners of philosophy. China is one of the longest-lasting civilizations of the world. But not everything about ancient China was as lovely and beautiful as the silk they produced. Welcome to Nutty History, and today, let's find out what creepy things were normal in ancient China. Being jobless in the modern economy is a downright survival hazard. Basic living needs have become so expensive that the world needs a revolution to secure a decent minimum wage. You might not want to believe this, but things were not much different in ancient China. In fact, they were so desperate to get a job, they were willing to get rid of their manhood for it. Yeah, you heard right. The Chinese poor were willing to let go of their jewels for the best job in entire China. Eunuchs were in high demand in Chinese palaces as well as brothels because of the inability to impregnate the emperor's concubines. However, as these were high-profile jobs with better than decent living and wages, this was the best shot any poor person had to have a better life without waddling through the mud of social hierarchy. What makes it more disturbing is that a lot of parents would castrate their children at birth themselves. However, if your parents didn't think ahead for your smooth career, it was a decent and fairly popular trend among grown men to castrate themselves. Ironically, it was a ballsy move. The eunuchs also had an opportunity to rise to higher ranks. For example, the duties and jobs of eunuchs gradually changed in the Ming Dynasty. Eventually, unified eunuchs grew so much in authority that empires became wary of their power and influence. Moreover, eunuchs were also responsible for babysitting, teaching, training, and serving emperors' sons who would eventually become emperors themselves. That gave them enough control over future kings, and eunuchs became the real center of power in China. These eunuchs had their eyes and ears everywhere, and just like Lord Varys from Game of Thrones, they were real-life Lord of Whispers who could make or break the kingdoms with their immense knowledge and impact on ancient Chinese politics. Things got so bad with eunuchs that in the Hongwu Emperor's time, the emperor decreed that the eunuchs were to be kept in small numbers and of minimal literacy to prevent them from seizing power. Still desperate and willing to chop their manhood off, People were castrating left and left in China. During the Ming Dynasty, the number of eunuchs in the empire had rocketed to over 100,000. With so many sacrificing their stick and balls, the government was forced to intervene and had to regulate this madness. There was an application process set up to control the anti-phallus mania, and for 200 copper coins, you could get your name on a list of eunuch applicants. They were applying to be a eunuch? Okay. 250 people on that list would get to work for the emperor out of thousands of applicants. Most of these ex-men wouldn't get the job, and they ended up begging in the streets. Sadly, they spent the rest of their lives knowing that they got nothing for thinking with their penises. Ancient China's history is filled with bloody conflicts that were horrifying and downright inhumane. The Chinese fought battles on the total war principle, which means do anything to win the war and annihilate the enemy. It was quite normal for soldiers in ancient China to slaughter enemy soldiers and civilians with no mercy. For example, Bai Qi of Qin killed enemy soldiers by burying them alive. But Fu Deng, Emperor Gao of Qin in the 4th century, took it a step further. Leading his troops to battle against the Qiang dynasty, he ordered his soldiers to not carry food-related stuff or rations. Instead, he asked his soldiers to earn their meals. Fight in the morning, and in the evening you can stuff yourselves on meat. You don't have to worry about going hungry. That was Fu Deng's mantra for his army. So how did he manage to feed thousands of soldiers without provisions? Simple. A soldier was asked to earn their meal. The only prize they had were the dead or captured enemy soldiers. Fu Deng soldiers would cook any enemy soldier, no matter deceased or living, to fill their bellies after fighting every day. If that doesn't get your stomach churning, wait till you hear what King Zhou did. When King Zhou of Shang defeated King Wen of Zhou, King Zhou killed King Wen's son and used the dead son's meat to make soup for King Wen. Humiliated and humbled, King Wen was so mortified of King Zhou's power that he ate all the soup despite being aware that the soup was made of his son's remains. What? The Chinese civilization began on the shores of the Yellow River and the northern banks of the river where water is freezing. It was common among ancient Chinese people to bathe very little, especially not at all during winters. Later, thanks to the spread of Taoism, bathing became even less prevalent in ancient China. The religion made people believe that bathing often can lead to sickness. This caused a lot of odor issues for Chinese people of all classes. Smelly issues aside, the superstition around bathing was also the cause of a massive lice infestation in Chinese people's scalps. However, according to doctors and healers of ancient China, lice were a sign of good health among common folks. These healers would also determine the survival chances of a patient from lice on their patient's body. If the lice were crawling all over the patient's body, an early Chinese medical document says he will survive. If the lice are scrambling off his body like rats fleeing a sinking ship, he will die. Interestingly, it's debatable if lice were feeding off poor Chinese or the other way around. The poor were used to being covered in lice, and many would compulsively pluck them off their hair and eat them. This happened so much that they had remedies to help people who ate too much of their own lice. They would be fed ashes and boiled water from old combs. The next time they visited the bathroom, the doctors promised, they would pass a belly full of lice. Apart from lice, human excrements were quite popular among healers and the poor alike. Crystal urine and yellow soup made of human feces were some of the most popular medicines among all doctors on the shores of the Yellow River back in the day. Human urine, specifically peed by people under the age of 10, was the most popular among ancient Chinese for marinating eggs and pickles. What I am about to tell you is arguably one of the most agonizing acts of cruelty against women in the history of the world. Medieval foot binding was a scourge of women in old China. And when we say medieval, we meant rather figuratively than literally. But the tradition carried on to the modern world and survived for more than a millennium. Chinese women, whether rich or poor, were encouraged to bind their feet as tightly as humanly possible, often breaking the feet structure in the process. The goal was to keep your foot less than 4 inches long. This inhumane practice left the foot a crushed, mutilated mound of flesh they called a lotus foot. This wasn't just something a few people did. At its peak, almost every upper-class woman and 50% of the lower class bound their feet in 10th century China. And the most creepy and perverse part about this atrocious mutilation was how men felt about it. To ancient Chinese men, these deformed lotus feet were the sexiest things on earth. Foreplay in ancient China was meant to start with a man fondling his partner's broken foot, and they put a lot of thought into it. During the Qing dynasty, they even released a coitus manual with 48 different ways to fondle a mutilated foot. To make it worse, they didn't just consider it appealing. In records, ancient Chinese men found these broken feet the sexiest part of a woman's body. According to their literature, women shouldn't be shy about showing any part of their body to their lovers except a broken foot. Women were encouraged to tease their lovers about revealing their feet and play with their emotions. A bare lotus foot was considered quite more erotic and what we call not safe for work today in ancient Chinese literature. Erotic? We doubt it. But not safe for work? We totally agree. Now, don't forget to smash that like button and tell us what you think in the comments. Tudor England was a roller coaster of an era. You had Henry VII come in and start eliminating public land, which many attribute to being the first step in establishing capitalism. You had Henry VIII come in and split from the Catholic Church so he could divorce his wife. You had Bloody Mary come in after that and rapidly pivot back to Catholicism. Here are some of the creepiest mysteries of Tudor England. The Princes of the Tower. The disappearance of the deposed child King Edward V and his brother Richard, often referred to as the Princes in the Tower, remains one of the creepiest and high-profile mysteries in English history. In 1483, following the death of their father, King Edward IV, the young boys were placed in the Tower of London by their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, supposedly so Edward could prepare for his coronation as the king. They were never seen again, and no one has yet figured out what happened. After the death of Edward IV, a power struggle ensued between Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, and the boy's mother's family, the Woodvilles. Richard had plans to take the throne for himself, and the sneaky bugger, is that British enough for you? The sneaky bugger had Parliament declare the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville invalid, and their kids, the young Ed and Rich, illegitimate. He then claimed the throne for himself as Richard III. The young princes, who were 12 and 9, were placed under Richard's protection, still in the Tower of London, but then, poof. At first, there wasn't much thought given to what happened to the boys. But as time passed, rumors began to circulate. Speculation grew, fueled by the controversial reign of Richard III and his pretty quick ousting after his defeat in the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. After Henry Tudor's victory and ascension to the throne as Henry VII, stories started to emerge that Richard III had ordered the murder of the young princes to secure his hold on power. The main source for this theory is the account written by Sir Thomas More, who was born several years after the events. More claimed that Richard III had ordered the hit, alleging that they were smothered with a pillow. But More's account might be a bit biased. He was a Tudor sympathizer, writing during the reign of Henry VIII, and given Henry's tendency to remove the heads of people who crossed him, More probably wanted some brownie points for painting Richard III in a negative light. Then, in 1674, during the reign of Charles II, a renovation of the Tower of London revealed 2 small skeletons buried under a staircase. At the time, it was widely believed that these were the remains of the princes in the tower. The skeletons were reburied in Westminster Abbey, and a monument was put up to commemorate them. Mystery solved, right? Well, the bones were re-examined in the 20th century, and the results were inconclusive. They couldn't say for sure that they belonged to little Edward and Richard. The skeletons were apparently too small to come to a conclusion. Too small? Hey, size matters. Also, the remains haven't been subjected to modern DNA testing to confirm their identities. The mystery surrounding the disappearance of Edward V and Richard remains unsolved, and various theories and alternative explanations have been put forward. While the Richard III offing them theory is still probably most likely, others have floated theories that they were secretly smuggled out of the tower and lived a life in hiding, or that they simply died from illness. Henry VIII's mysterious will. You know, with all the mystery and controversy and bloodshed that surrounded the court of Henry VIII during his lifetime, one of the strangest mysteries of all came after he died. His last will and testament has been the center of endless debate over the years. Debate that's been endless because of the fact that the original copy has been lost. First of all, Henry VIII's will went through multiple revisions and alterations. They all were made during the very last days of his life, when his mental and physical health were slipping away fast. The changes introduced uncertainties and contradictions that left room for different interpretations of things. It's thought that Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, they were pretty involved in shaping the final version of the document to advance their own political agendas. Both were prominent Protestant reformers who were looking to secure their own positions and advance the Protestant cause. Their involvement has raised questions about their motivations and where they manipulated the document to serve their own interest. Another controversial aspect of Henry's will was the issue of succession. By bypassing his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, who were the eldest, and instead going with his young son Edward as his heir, Henry departed from the traditional line of succession. The decision was seen as favoring Protestant interests and securing the Protestant direction of the English Reformation. The exclusion of Mary, who was a devout Catholic, also created a whole lot of conflict down the line when she eventually became the Queen. The alterations in Henry's will had significant legal and constitutional implications too. The document established a precedent for monarchs to exert their will over the line of succession, bypassing the traditional order. It also raised questions about the authority of Parliament in matters of succession and the extent to which a monarch could dictate the future of the kingdom. But suspicions of tampering with the will and the crazy butterfly effects that they had for the next century, which was marked by ongoing tensions between Catholics and Protestants, may never be proven because the original copy was lost. Don't drink the soup. If you were around during the reign of Henry VIII, you might not have wanted to drink the soup made by a cook named Richard Roos. Or maybe it was fine. We still aren't sure whether this obscure cook deserved one of the most horribly ironic death sentences in the history of death sentences. In fact, Anne Boleyn herself might have ordered it. The trial and execution of Richard Roos in 1531 was a bubbling pot of speculation and exaggerated justice. Roos was accused of poisoning the soup of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, a staunch Catholic who was very much opposed to Henry VIII's efforts to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. The trial and subsequent execution of Roos were politically charged and served as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the king's authority. Richard Roos was a cook in Fisher's household. In February 1531, Roos allegedly poisoned a pot of porridge or soup that was then served up to the bishop and several other people at the house. Now, for some reason, Fisher didn't eat that day, but about 17 other people did, and for 2 of them, it was the last meal they ever ate. Sure hope that soup was at least good. Upon discovering the poisoning, the authorities arrested Roos, who was later put on trial for his alleged crime. The trial took place in March 1531 at the Guildhall in London. Roos was charged with high treason, as poisoning someone to death was retroactively made an act of treason against the king. And by retroactively, I mean that Henry VIII, apparently quite afraid of being poisoned himself, literally issued a decree that made the act treason while Roos was awaiting trial. A trial that would never come to court. There were apparently witnesses who claimed that Roos had confessed to the crime, and others who testified about the effects of the poisoning. Roos, on the other hand, claimed that he thought the white powder he put in the soup was a laxative and was meant to be a joke. The thing is, though, Roos never testified. We don't know if he ever really said this. There's also speculation that he wasn't even the cook in the bishop's household. And like I said, there wasn't even a trial. Crazy, huh? Henry had pushed the whole case through quickly, suspiciously quickly, equating murder with treason against the king, which helped him out a lot in the years to come, when he used this new precedent to end anyone who opposed him. In the end, the ultimate joke was on Roos. He was found guilty of treason and he was sentenced to a gruesome, very rare, unusual, and ironic form of punishment. He was to be boiled alive. The soup poisoner quite literally became the main ingredient in his own soup. On April 15, 1532, Roos was taken to Smithfield, a public punishment site in London. They had those back then. A large cauldron was filled with boiling water, and Roos was submerged in it. It took 2 hours, and he was reportedly dunked 3 times. Like a donut. Then there's the idea that Anne Boleyn or members of her family ordered the hit and set Roos up. The bishop was opposed to Anne marrying Henry after all, and getting him out of the way would have been beneficial to her becoming the queen. It would also explain Henry's crazy reaction to the whole event. Was he trying to cover something up? No evidence of Anne's involvement has ever been uncovered, but the speculation has persisted over the centuries. Elizabethan plots.
When Elizabeth I came to power in 1558 and started doing everything in her power to make England Protestant again, there were a lot of Catholics who were not happy. Bloody Mary had tried her bloodiest to punish as many Protestants as possible during the previous 5 years. But Elizabeth I was a Protestant and swung to the other extreme soon after her coronation.
What followed was a crazy series of attempts on her life, many of which were, in part, orchestrated by the Catholic Church and the Jesuits in particular. 4 of the most famous plots were the Babington plot, the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and one called the Essex coup. I mean, it's a miracle that Elizabeth made it past her coronation. Elizabeth herself claimed that there were hundreds of plots to take her out, many of them allegedly planned by Jesuits. First up in our long line of attempts on Elizabeth's life, we have the Ridolfi plot. The event was named after Robert Ridolfi, an Italian banker and merchant who was the main player in an attempt to dethrone Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. Ridolfi had been moving in the shadows during the late 1560s and early 70s, traveling between Rome, Brussels, and Madrid, and acting as a messenger between Mary and the Catholic powers in Europe. Mary had been forced to abdicate the Scottish throne because of her Catholic leanings, which Elizabeth didn't like. She was also trying to claim the English throne, another thing that Elizabeth wasn't feeling at all. As a result, Mary spent a whole lot of time in Scottish and English prisons and, planning to kill the Queen.
The plan involved an invasion by Spanish forces and a rebellion by English Catholics. But the theory was exposed in 1571, thanks in large part to Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham, who was able to intercept and decode a bunch of encrypted letters being sent between Mary, Ridolfi, and their plotters, who included Catholic higher-ups and even the King of Spain.
In 1571, Walsingham caught one of the messengers, a Flemish papal agent named Charles Bailey. Papal agents, by the way, were basically like Catholic spies that the Pope authorized to sow chaos and dissent all over Europe against anyone not being Catholic enough. After punishing Bailey on something called the rack, a very sweet and not at all painful device that slowly pulls your limbs apart, Bailey spilled the beans about the cipher and he was thrown in jail. But surprisingly, he was not killed. Soon after, Ridolfi was arrested and imprisoned. Also surprisingly, he was saved from many punishments that were loved back then. Then came the Throckmorton plot. This one was led by Francis Throckmorton and involved another Catholic theory against Elizabeth. Throckmorton, a prominent Catholic sympathizer, wanted to overthrow Elizabeth by killing her and replacing her with Mary, Queen of Scots. This plot involved the coordination of a French invasion and support from the Catholic nobility in England. But the theory was uncovered in 1583 thanks to the efforts of Sir Francis Walsingham's network of spies. Throckmorton was arrested, interrogated, and sent to death for treason.
Then a few years later in 1586, there was the Babington plot, named after the nobleman Anthony Babington. It was yet another theory to assassinate Elizabeth and install Mary on the English throne. Are you seeing a pattern here? Babington, who was obviously a Catholic, was persuaded by Jesuit priests and papal agents to participate in the plot. The scheme involved yet another plan to invade England, and this time they switched back to trying to get the Spanish to do it instead of the French.
But the plot was uncovered yet again by Elizabeth's intrepid spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. But he better have gotten a raise. Babington and his co-plotters were arrested, tried for treason, and subsequently punished. A year later, Mary, Queen of Scots, would meet the same fate. Once Mary was out of the picture, you'd think their attempts on Elizabeth's life would have slowed down, but apparently they didn't. The Essex plot, or Essex Rebellion, occurred in 1601 and involved the Earl of Essex, a guy named Robert Devereux. Essex was a former favorite of Elizabeth who fell out of favor and became unhappy with the Queen's policies. In an attempt to gain more power, Essex gathered a group of supporters and attempted a rebellion against Elizabeth's government. The rebellion? Yeah, it failed, and Essex was captured, tried, and sent to death for treason. Elizabeth I probably had more lives than a cat, and she can thank the fact that she died of illness at the age of 69 instead of at the gallows or because of a punctured wound from her spy master extraordinaire, Sir Francis Walsingham. Monastery mysteries.
The reign of Henry VIII was also marked by the widespread destruction of the monasteries across the kingdom, and with them the loss of some pretty valuable relics and manuscripts. One of the most famous mysteries is the legend of the Glastonbury thorn. That's a type of hawthorn tree that was said to have sprung miraculously from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea upon his arrival in Glastonbury. The tree apparently only bloomed twice a year, during Christmas and Easter. It was clearly aware of Jesus.
But after the dissolution of the monasteries, including Glastonbury Abbey in the 1530s, the Glastonbury thorn vanished. While some cuttings were preserved and replanted, the original tree disappeared. The dissolution of the monasteries involved the seizure and dispersal of tons of valuable religious relics and treasures that had been accumulated within their walls over the centuries. Many of these items, including saintly relics and artifacts, were lost or destroyed. The fate of these relics and treasures is often the subject of speculation, with some suggesting that they were sold, melted down, or simply lost over time. And who doesn't love a good secret chamber? Some monks or nuns who resisted the dissolution or tried to protect sacred items and manuscripts went into hiding. It's thought that some hidden chambers and secret passages were dug out within the monastic buildings to hide valuable items. The exact locations of these hiding places remains unknown, and a lot of treasures and relics might still lie undiscovered. The Vanished Colony. In the late 16th century, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, England was trying to establish colonies in the New World. In 1585, a group of settlers led by Sir Walter Raleigh established the English colony of Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. This initial settlement struggled, and the colonists eventually returned to England.
In 1587, another attempt was made to establish a permanent colony on Roanoke Island, known as the Lost Colony. This group of about 115 settlers, including men, women, and children, arrived under the leadership of John White. But almost as quickly as he arrived, White had to go back to England to seek out more supplies and support. He left behind his pregnant wife, Eleanor Dare, and a Native American ally named Chief Manteo.
When White returned to Roanoke Island 3 years later, everyone had vanished. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a post and crow etched into a tree. Maybe, just maybe, he thought, they had journeyed inland to a place called Croatoan, Chief Manteo's homeland near present-day Cape Hatteras on the Outer Banks. But before he could conduct a search, a hurricane blew in, damaging his ships and forcing him to return to England. He'd never be back. White couldn't raise enough money to finance another trip, and the search mission fell into the hands of Sir Walter Raleigh. The explorer wasn't very interested in finding the colonists, though. If they continued to be declared missing instead of dead, he could keep his legal claim on Virginia. When he did sail over to North America in 1595, he said he was searching for the colonists, but what he was really searching for was the legendary El Dorado. He wanted to strike it rich. He sailed by the Outer Banks without even stopping to have a look. So we still don't know what happened to the lost colony. However, the discovery of a new lead in 2012 involving a map painted by John White could provide some clues. The map in question is called La Vernia Pars. It looks like your standard, not-so-accurate 16th century map of the New World, but hidden within it, in invisible ink, are the outlines of two forts. These hidden fort outlines offer a potential clue about the fate of the Roanoke colonists. One of the forts is about 50 miles west of Roanoke Island, which aligns pretty well with the distance the colonists had reportedly planned to move, according to John White's writings. This discovery suggests that the colonists may have up and moved there.
The inclusion of invisible ink on the map was probably a measure taken by White to safeguard information about the colonies from potential Spanish spies. During this period, England and Spain were fighting a lot over who could steal the most land from the Native Americans. There was all kinds of spycraft going on. Spain reportedly even created a fake plan to destroy the Roanoke colony, which they then leaked to the British as a kind of misdirection campaign.
White clearly didn't want Spanish agents to get their hands on a map that showed the location of two British forts. Still, though, the map doesn't prove anything. Maybe the colonists moved to one of these forts, but it's also quite possible that they were taken out by Native Americans. The Virginia colonists weren't exactly buddy-buddy with many of the tribes. Henry's missing wives.
Henry VIII did have 6 wives, so can you blame him for forgetting where 2 of them were buried? Well, that's not exactly what happened, but the remains of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, 2 out of the 6, respectively, have been lost to history, and like all those attempts on Elizabeth I's life, religion might be the culprit.
Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, was famously demeloned in 1536 on charges of adultery, treason, and jumping on the bed with her brother. After her killing at the Tower of London, she was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the Tower grounds, but nobody seems to know where exactly. There are a few reasons for the unfortunate loss of Anne Boleyn's remains. First, during the English Reformation, Henry VIII's Protestant regime tried really hard to suppress anything Catholic, which included the veneration of saints and relics. This led to the destruction of monastic institutions and the desecration of their associated burials, including Anne Boleyn's resting place. Second, during the reign of Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, who was also Anne Boleyn's daughter, there was a concerted effort to distance the monarchy from the controversial and scandalous legacy of her mother. Conveniently forgetting where her grave could have been was a good way to help out that cause. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, was also separated from her head in 1542 on charges of adultery and treason, reportedly in the very same spot where Anne met her maker. After her death, her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula alongside Anne Boleyn. But just like Anne, the precise location of Catherine's grave within the chapel is unknown.
The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula also underwent some renovations and repairs over the centuries, which may have disturbed or displaced the remains buried within. Time, plus the lack of accurate records, plus Henry VIII simply not really caring about the wives he very clearly wasn't fond of, further contributed to the loss of their final resting places.
Despite efforts over the years by historians and archaeologists to locate and identify the graves of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, including exploratory work within the Tower of London, their remains are still a mystery. Elizabeth's dead friend.
The mysterious death of Amy Robsart, the wife of a guy named Robert Dudley and a close friend of Queen Elizabeth I, proved that while Elizabeth might have been able to escape a lot of attempts on her life, some of her friends and allies weren't so lucky. Amy Robsart's death occurred on September 8, 1560, at Cumnor Place, the residence she was staying at in Oxfordshire, England. Her demise was an unfortunate one. It was basically the Tudor-era version of the staircase.
On the day of her death, Amy Robsart was found at the bottom of a flight of stairs in Cumnor Place, apparently having suffered a fatal fall. The circumstances surrounding her demise sparked a whole lot of suspicion and raised questions about foul play. Given her close association with Elizabeth I's favorite courtier, Robert Dudley, and the political climate of the time, theories and rumors quickly started swirling. Many suggested that Amy's death was a result of a theory to remove her from the scene, allowing Robert Dudley to pursue a romantic relationship with Queen Elizabeth I.
Those in the Dudley did it camp said he would have been motivated by his desire for power and influence, and may have orchestrated Amy's death to clear the path for his royal ambitions. But no direct evidence linking Dudley to Amy's staircase tumble has ever been found, and the official investigation at the time concluded that her demise was accidental.
The circumstances surrounding Amy Robsart's death and the subsequent speculation it generated have inspired numerous works of fiction, including Sir Walter Scott's novel Kenilworth. These fictional retellings often depict her death as a murder driven by jealousy and political intrigue.
What other creepy Tudor mysteries do you want to learn about? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more nutty history.